The winter wind cut across the North Platte River like a blade. But Adelaide Langston didn't flinch as she gripped the ferry rope and pulled with arms made strong from months of relentless work. November of 1876 had brought ice to the edges of the water, and most folks thought she would close down the crossing until spring. But Adelaide needed every cent she could earn, and she would be damned if a little cold weather would stop her from making a living in Fort Bridger, Wyoming. She had been running the ferry for 8 months now, ever since her father took sick and died, leaving her nothing but debts and this rickety flat-bottomed boat that carried people and cargo across the river. At 22 years old, Adelaide had learned quickly that the world didn't care much about a woman's struggles, and if she wanted to survive, she would have to be harder than the men who looked at her with either pity or contempt. The first snow had fallen 3 days ago, and the temperature had dropped so low that Adelaide could see her breath hanging in the air like ghosts. She wore her father's old coat, wool pants tucked into boots, and leather gloves with the fingers cut out so she could maintain her grip on the ropes. Her dark blonde hair was tied back in a practical braid, and her green eyes scanned the opposite shore where a single rider waited on a bay horse. She recognized him immediately. He had been crossing her ferry every single day for the past 2 weeks, always at the same time in the morning, and then again in the evening. He was a cowboy. That much was clear from his worn leather chaps and the lasso tied to his saddle. He sat tall in the saddle, and even from this distance, Adelaide could make out the line of his jaw and the way he seemed to study everything around him with careful attention. The ferry groaned as she pulled it across the current, her muscles burning with the familiar ache that had become her constant companion. The cowboy waited patiently, never calling out or hurrying her along like some of the other passengers did. When the ferry bumped against the far shore, he dismounted and led his horse onto the wooden platform with a quiet word that Adelaide couldn't quite hear. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and warm, and Adelaide noticed that his eyes were a striking blue, the color of the sky on a clear summer day. "Morning," she replied, already turning to begin the journey back across the river. She didn't have time for small talk, not when every crossing meant money in her pocket, and every delay meant the risk of ice forming too thick to break through. The cowboy stood near his horse, one hand resting on the animal's neck. Adelaide could feel him watching her as she hauled on the rope, hand over hand, her breath coming in steady puffs of white vapor. The river was running fast today, swollen from recent snow in the mountains, and it took all her concentration to keep the ferry moving in a straight line. "You do this all by yourself?" the cowboy asked after a few minutes of silence. "Nobody else to do it," Adelaide said, not looking at him. She had heard the question before, usually followed by some comment about how a woman shouldn't be doing such hard work or how she needed a husband to take care of her. She braced herself for whatever this cowboy would say, but he surprised her. "That's impressive," he said simply. "I have been watching you work for 2 weeks now, and I have never seen anyone handle a ferry with such skill." Adelaide did glance at him then, searching his face for any sign of mockery, but his expression was earnest. "You have been watching me?" she asked, and immediately wished she hadn't because it sounded too interested, too personal. The cowboy had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "I suppose that sounds strange," he said. "My name is Jackson Reynolds. I work at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles east of here. I have been riding into town every day on business, but I will admit that I look forward to the ferry crossing more than anything else." Adelaide felt something flutter in her chest, something she quickly pushed down because she didn't have time for feelings, especially not for a cowboy who would probably be moving on to some other ranch or some other town before winter was truly upon them. "Adelaide Langston," she said, because it seemed rude not to introduce herself after he had been so forthright. The ferry bumped against the Fort Bridger shore, and Jackson led his horse off the platform. Before he rode away, he turned back to look at her. "I will see you this evening, Miss Langston," he said, and there was something in his tone that made Adelaide think he meant more than just the ferry crossing. She watched him ride toward town, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared around a bend in the road. Then she turned her attention back to the river, because there were other passengers waiting, and the day was far from over. The hours passed in a blur of crossings. Adelaide ferried a wagon full of supplies for the general store, a family heading west to Oregon, 2 miners with their mules loaded down with equipment, and a traveling preacher who tried to save her soul while she pulled the rope. Her hands were numb despite the gloves, and her shoulders screamed with fatigue, but she kept going because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant wondering why a cowboy named Jackson Reynolds would ride the ferry twice a day just to watch her work. When the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Adelaide saw Jackson returning. He was alone this time, no packages or supplies tied to his saddle, and he seemed in no particular hurry. He waited on the far shore while she brought the ferry across, and when he loaded his horse onto the platform, he smiled at her. "Busy day?" he asked. "Every day is busy," Adelaide replied, but she found herself smiling back despite her best intentions. "I brought you something," Jackson said, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth and held it out to her. "I figured you probably don't take much time for meals when you are working." Adelaide hesitated, then took the bundle. Inside was fresh bread, cheese, and sliced ham. Her stomach growled immediately, betraying how little she had eaten that day. "You didn't have to do this," she said, but her voice was softer than she intended. "I wanted to," Jackson said. "A person can't work as hard as you do without proper food." They were halfway across the river when Adelaide finally allowed herself to eat. The bread was still warm, and the cheese was sharp and flavorful. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, to savor it instead of wolfing it down like a starving animal. Jackson didn't say much during the crossing, but his silence was comfortable rather than awkward. When they reached the Fort Bridger shore, he lingered for a moment before mounting his horse. "Miss Langston," he said, "would you mind if I helped you close up the ferry for the night? It looks like heavy work, securing everything against the current." Adelaide wanted to say no, wanted to maintain her independence and prove that she didn't need anyone's help, but the truth was that closing up the ferry was heavy work, and she was exhausted. "I wouldn't mind," she said finally. Together, they secured the ferry to its moorings, wrapping the ropes around thick wooden posts driven deep into the frozen ground. Jackson worked with the easy competence of a man used to physical labor, and Adelaide found herself appreciating the way he didn't try to take over, didn't act like he knew better than her. He followed her instructions, lifted where she needed lifting, and pulled where she needed pulling. When they were finished, darkness had settled over the river. The temperature had dropped even further, and Adelaide could feel the cold seeping through her father's old coat. Jackson noticed her shivering and frowned. "Where do you live?" he asked. Adelaide pointed to a small cabin about 100 yards from the river, barely visible in the gathering darkness. "There," she said. "It was my father's, now it's mine." "Let me walk you home," Jackson said. "It's dark and you never know what might be out here." Adelaide wanted to argue, wanted to say that she had been walking this path alone for months and didn't need an escort, but the truth was that she was tired down to her bones, and the thought of having company for the short walk was more appealing than she cared to admit. The cabin was small and drafty, with a single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and sitting area all at once. Adelaide had a fire going in the stone fireplace, and the orange glow was visible through the single window. When they reached the door, Jackson tipped his hat to her. "Thank you for letting me help," he said, "and for the conversation. It's nice to talk to someone who actually listens." "Thank you for the food," Adelaide replied, "and for the help." Jackson mounted his horse and rode off into the darkness, and Adelaide went inside, closing the door against the cold night air. She stood by the fire for a long moment, warming her hands and thinking about blue eyes and a warm voice, and the way Jackson had looked at her like she was someone worth knowing. The next morning brought more snow and colder temperatures. Adelaide woke before dawn, as she always did, and made herself a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee. The fire had died down during the night, and the cabin was freezing. She could see her breath in the air as she dressed in layers, preparing for another day on the river. When she reached the ferry, the edges of the river had frozen overnight, and she had to break through a thin layer of ice to get the ferry moving. Her hands were already aching from the cold, and the sun hadn't even risen yet. She wondered, not for the first time, if she was being foolish, if she should just close down until spring like everyone expected her to. But then she thought about her father's debts, about the merchants in town who were waiting for their money, about the fact that if she didn't work, she didn't eat, and she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. Jackson arrived at his usual time, riding out of the gray morning mist like something from a dream. He was wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a wool scarf, but his eyes were the same bright blue, and he smiled when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Langston," he said, dismounting to lead his horse onto the ferry. "Morning, Mr. Reynolds," Adelaide replied, gripping the rope and beginning to pull. "I was thinking," Jackson said, "about your operation here. Have you considered using a pulley system? It might make the work easier, especially in winter when the current is stronger." Adelaide had considered it, but pulleys cost money, and money was something she didn't have much of. "I have thought about it," she admitted, "but I am making do with what I have." Jackson nodded, understanding in his expression. "I could help you build one," he offered. "I am fairly handy with tools, and the Double R has plenty of spare lumber and rope. It wouldn't cost you anything." Adelaide's pride warred with her practicality. She didn't like accepting charity, didn't like feeling like she owed anyone anything. But she also recognized a good offer when she heard one, and if a pulley system could make her work easier, she would be a fool to turn it down just because of stubbornness. "Why would you do that?" she asked, needing to understand his motivation. Jackson was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow past the ferry. "Because I admire what you are doing," he said finally. "You could have given up when your father died. You could have sold the ferry, moved back east, found some easier life. But you stayed and you worked, and you didn't let anyone tell you that you couldn't do it. That takes courage, and I respect it." There was something in his voice, something genuine and heartfelt, that made Adelaide believe him. "All right," she said. "I would appreciate the help." They made plans for Jackson to return on Sunday, his day off from the ranch, with materials and tools. The rest of the crossing passed in comfortable conversation, with Jackson telling her about his work at the Double R and Adelaide sharing stories about some of her more memorable passengers. When they reached the far shore, Jackson paused before riding away. "Miss Langston," he said, "may I call you Adelaide?" "Only if I can call you Jackson," she replied, and his smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I would like that very much," he said. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Jackson rode the ferry every morning and every evening, and each time he brought something with him. Sometimes it was food, fresh biscuits or jerky or apples from the ranch's stores. Sometimes it was just conversation, stories about his life and questions about hers. Adelaide found herself looking forward to his crossings, found herself scanning the horizon for the sight of his bay horse, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. She had been alone for so long, had built walls around her heart to protect herself from the pain of loss and the cruelty of a world that didn't think much of women who worked with their hands. But Jackson was slowly dismantling those walls, brick by brick. With his kindness and his genuine interest in her life, on Sunday, he arrived with a wagon full of lumber, rope, and iron fittings. He had another man with him, an older cowboy named Pete who worked at the Double R and apparently had experience with mechanical systems. Pete here helped build the lifting mechanism for the barn's hay loft, Jackson explained. I figured we could use his expertise. Adelaide showed them where she wanted the pulley system installed, and the two men set to work. She tried to help, but Jackson gently insisted that she take the day off, that she had earned a rest. So Adelaide sat on the shore and watched them work, marveling at the way they moved together, the easy camaraderie between them. By late afternoon, they had constructed a system of pulleys and counterweights that made pulling the ferry across the river significantly easier. Jackson demonstrated how it worked, and Adelaide could immediately feel the difference. What had taken all her strength before now required only half the effort. "This is amazing," she said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "Thank you, both of you." Pete waved off her thanks and climbed back into the wagon, claiming he needed to get back to the ranch before dark. But Jackson stayed behind, and Adelaide invited him into her cabin for coffee. The cabin seemed even smaller with Jackson in it, his tall frame making the space feel cramped. But it was warm and the coffee was hot, and Adelaide found herself relaxing in a way she rarely allowed herself to. "Tell me about your father," Jackson said, cradling his coffee cup in his large hands. "What was he like?" Adelaide hadn't talked about her father much since his death. The grief was still too raw, too close to the surface. But something about Jackson made her want to share, made her feel safe enough to open up. "He was a good man," she said quietly. "Strong and hard-working and honest. He came west after my mother died, looking for a fresh start. He bought the ferry with money he had saved from working in the railroad camps, and he made a decent living from it. But then he got sick last winter, some kind of fever that the doctor couldn't treat. He held on until spring, and then he was just gone." Jackson reached across the small table and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, and Adelaide didn't pull away. "I am sorry," he said. "Losing a parent is never easy." "He left debts," Adelaide continued, needing to say it all now that she had started. "Medical bills, money owed to suppliers. I have been working to pay them off, but it feels like I will never get ahead. Every time I save a little, something breaks or someone needs to be paid, and I am right back where I started." "How much do you owe?" Jackson asked. Adelaide told him the figure, and he was quiet for a long moment. "That's not insurmountable," he said finally. "Especially not with winter coming and more people needing to cross the river because the bridge upriver freezes solid." "You think so?" Adelaide asked, allowing herself a small glimmer of hope. "I know so," Jackson said firmly, "and I will help you however I can, not because I pity you but because I care about you." Adelaide's heart skipped a beat. "You barely know me," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "I know enough," Jackson replied. "I know you are strong and brave and determined. I know you don't give up when things get hard. I know you have a smile that makes my whole day brighter. That's enough for me." Adelaide didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything at all. She just held Jackson's hand and let herself feel something other than tired and worried for the first time in months. As November gave way to December, the weather grew even colder. The river began to freeze in earnest, with thick sheets of ice forming along the edges and sometimes reaching out toward the middle. Adelaide had to break through ice every morning before she could operate the ferry, and the work was exhausting even with the pulley system. But Jackson was there every day, helping her break the ice, helping her secure the ferry, bringing her food and warm drinks and conversation that made her forget about the cold. Other passengers noticed the attention he paid her, and Adelaide endured their knowing looks and occasional comments with as much grace as she could muster. One evening in mid-December, after the last crossing of the day, Jackson helped her secure the ferry and then didn't immediately leave as he usually did. Instead, he stood on the shore, looking out at the frozen river, his expression thoughtful. "What is it?" Adelaide asked, moving to stand beside him. "I have been thinking about something," Jackson said slowly. "The ranch is cutting back for the winter. They don't need as many hands, and I am one of the newer hires, so I might be let go until spring." Adelaide's stomach dropped. "You are leaving?" she asked, and she couldn't keep the dismay out of her voice. "Not if I can help it," Jackson said quickly. "I was thinking I could help you with the ferry. You could hire me on as an assistant. It wouldn't have to be much pay, just enough for room and board. I could sleep in the lean-to behind your cabin, and I could help with the heavy work." Adelaide wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to grab onto the offer with both hands, but she forced herself to think practically. "I don't know if I can afford to hire anyone," she said. "I am barely making ends meet as it is." "You could afford me," Jackson said. "I don't need much, just a place to sleep and food to eat and the chance to be near you." His honesty took Adelaide's breath away. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you want to be near me?" Jackson turned to face her fully, and in the fading light, his blue eyes were intense. "Because I am falling in love with you, Adelaide Langston," he said. "I have been falling in love with you since the first time I saw you pull that ferry across the river with such determination and strength. I love the way you face every challenge without complaining. I love the way you care for your passengers, even the difficult ones. I love the way your eyes light up when you talk about your father. I love everything about you, and I want to be part of your life if you will have me." Adelaide felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them away furiously because she didn't cry. She never cried. But these were good tears, happy tears, and she didn't know what to do with the overwhelming emotion that flooded through her. "I don't know if I can love you back," she said honestly. "I don't know if I even know how. I have spent so long just surviving that I forgot how to feel anything else." "Then let me teach you," Jackson said, stepping closer. "Let me show you that life can be more than just work and worry. Let me help you carry the burden. You don't have to do everything alone anymore." Adelaide looked up at him, at this good, kind man who had come into her life like an unexpected gift, and she made a decision. "All right," she said. "You can stay. You can help with the ferry. But I can't promise you anything beyond that, not yet." "I will take what you can give," Jackson said, and he reached out to cup her face with his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "And I will wait for the rest." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Adelaide didn't want to. She wanted to know what it felt like to be kissed by someone who looked at her like she hung the moon and stars. So she stood on her toes and met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it was like coming home to a place she had never been. The kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise and hope. When they finally pulled apart, Adelaide was smiling, really smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I think I could learn to love you, Jackson Reynolds," she said softly. "I will do everything in my power to make sure you do," he replied. True to his word, Jackson moved into the lean-to behind Adelaide's cabin the next day. It was a rough space, little more than a shed with a cot and a small stove, but Jackson fixed it up with scraps from the ranch and his own belongings. He hung blankets to keep out the drafts, brought in his bedroll and spare clothes, and made it into something livable. Working together on the ferry was a revelation. With Jackson's help, Adelaide could take on more crossings, could accommodate larger loads, could even take short breaks to warm up and eat. The work that had been grinding her down to nothing became manageable, even enjoyable when Jackson was there to share the burden. They developed a rhythm, an unspoken understanding of who would do what and when. Jackson had a natural feel for the river, could read the currents and anticipate problems before they arose. Adelaide taught him the business side, how to negotiate fares, how to handle difficult customers, how to keep the accounts. At night, they ate dinner together in Adelaide's cabin, sharing the cooking and the cleanup. Jackson was a surprisingly good cook, having learned from his mother before she passed away when he was young. He made hearty stews and fresh cornbread, and Adelaide contributed whatever vegetables she had stored away and the occasional chicken from the small coop behind the cabin. They talked about everything and nothing. Jackson told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father who had been a farmer until a drought destroyed their crops and forced them to move west. Adelaide shared memories of her mother, a gentle woman who had died giving birth to what would have been Adelaide's younger sibling. They talked about their dreams and their fears, their hopes for the future and their regrets about the past. And slowly, carefully, they fell deeper in love. It wasn't always easy. They had their disagreements, their moments of frustration when the work was hard and the weather was terrible and they were both exhausted. But they learned to talk through their problems, to apologize when they were wrong, to compromise when they needed to. Adelaide learned that Jackson had a temper, quick to flare when he thought someone was treating her unfairly, but just as quick to cool down when she talked him through it. Jackson learned that Adelaide could be stubborn to a fault, refusing help even when she desperately needed it, clinging to her independence like a shield. But they also learned each other's better qualities. Adelaide discovered that Jackson was patient and kind, that he had a way with animals and children, that he could make her laugh even on the hardest days. Jackson saw that beneath Adelaide's tough exterior was a woman who felt everything deeply, who loved fiercely and completely when she finally allowed herself to. Christmas came and went quietly. They couldn't afford much in the way of celebration, but Jackson carved Adelaide a small wooden box for her keepsakes, and Adelaide knitted him a warm scarf from wool she had been saving. They cooked a special dinner and sat by the fire, and Jackson held her hand and told her it was the best Christmas he had ever had. January brought a blizzard that shut down the ferry for 3 days. Adelaide worried about the lost income, but Jackson kept her busy repairing equipment and organizing the supply shed. When the storm finally passed, they emerged to find the river partially frozen, with ice thick enough that some people were considering just walking across. But Adelaide knew how dangerous that was, knew that the ice could break without warning, plunging someone into water so cold it would kill them in minutes. So she and Jackson worked tirelessly to keep a channel open, breaking ice every morning, keeping the ferry operational even when it would have been easier to just close down. Their dedication earned them respect from the townspeople. The mayor of Fort Bridger came to the ferry one day and commended Adelaide for her service, saying that the town relied on the crossing and appreciated her commitment. He even hinted that the town council might be willing to help with repairs in the spring, a subtle acknowledgement that Adelaide's ferry was a vital piece of infrastructure. Word got around about Jackson too, about how he had helped Adelaide, about how they worked together like a well-oiled machine. Some people gossiped, suggesting impropriety, but most saw it for what it was: two people who had found each other and were making the best of a hard situation. On Valentine's Day, Jackson surprised Adelaide with a picnic lunch. He closed the ferry for an hour, which Adelaide initially protested, but he insisted, saying that even ferry operators deserved a break. He had made sandwiches and brought a jar of preserved peaches, and they sat in the cabin while snow fell outside, warm and content. "I have something for you," Jackson said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box, and Adelaide's heart began to race. "Jackson," she said, but he held up a hand. "Let me say this," he said. "Adelaide Langston, I love you more than I ever thought possible. You are the strongest, bravest, most amazing woman I have ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I know we haven't been together long, and I know you might not be ready, but I had to ask. Will you marry me?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond, nothing extravagant but beautiful in its simplicity. Adelaide stared at it, her mind racing. She had been alone for so long, had convinced herself that marriage and family weren't in her future, that she would spend her life running the ferry and that would be enough. But looking at Jackson, at his hopeful expression and his kind eyes, Adelaide realized that she didn't want to be alone anymore. She wanted to build a life with this man, wanted to wake up beside him every morning, wanted to share her burdens and her joys with him. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like freedom. "Yes, I will marry you, Jackson Reynolds." Jackson's whoop of joy could probably be heard across the river. He swept Adelaide into his arms and spun her around the small cabin, both of them laughing like children. When he finally set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger, and Adelaide marveled at how right it felt, how complete. They were married in March, when the first hints of spring were beginning to show. The ceremony was small, held in the town church with just a handful of witnesses. Adelaide wore a simple blue dress, the nicest thing she owned, and Jackson wore a new suit he had saved up for. Pete from the ranch stood as Jackson's best man, and Mrs. Henderson from the general store stood with Adelaide. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and when Jackson kissed her, Adelaide felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They held a small reception at the saloon, which the owner had generously offered to host free of charge. The townspeople who had come to respect Adelaide's determination and work ethic celebrated with them, toasting their happiness and wishing them well. That night, Jackson moved his belongings from the lean-to into the cabin, and they lay together in Adelaide's small bed, talking quietly about their future. They both knew that running the ferry would continue to be hard work, that there would be challenges and difficulties ahead. But they also knew that they would face those challenges together, and that made all the difference. As winter gave way to spring, the river began to thaw. The ice broke apart in great chunks that floated downstream, and the water ran high and fast with snowmelt from the mountains. Adelaide and Jackson worked longer hours to accommodate the increased traffic, farmers and merchants and travelers all eager to get moving after the long winter. The pulley system that Jackson had built proved its worth 1,000 times over. Adelaide couldn't imagine how she had managed without it, couldn't imagine how she had done any of this alone. Having Jackson by her side made everything better, easier, more bearable. In April, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited until she was certain before telling Jackson. When she finally shared the news over dinner one evening, Jackson's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He was thrilled, immediately planning and worrying and talking about what they would need to do to prepare. "We will need to expand the cabin," he said, his mind already working through the logistics. "Build on a room for the baby. And we should hire someone to help with the ferry, at least for a while after the baby comes." Adelaide listened to him plan, warmth spreading through her chest. She had been nervous about his reaction, worried that a baby would be an unwelcome burden, but she should have known better. Jackson wanted this just as much as she did, wanted to build a family with her. They worked through the spring and into the summer, saving every penny they could. Adelaide's belly grew slowly but steadily, and Jackson was constantly worrying about her, insisting she take breaks, refusing to let her do the heaviest work. Adelaide found his concern endearing even when it was frustrating. With the money they had saved and a small loan from the bank, they hired a carpenter to build an addition onto the cabin. 2 new rooms, one for the baby and one to expand their living space. Jackson worked alongside the carpenter in his free hours, learning the trade and helping to keep costs down. They also hired a young man named Timothy to help with the ferry. He was eager and hardworking, if a bit clumsy at first, but he learned quickly under Adelaide's patient instruction. Having the extra help meant that Adelaide could start to step back a bit, could prepare for the baby's arrival without worrying that the ferry would fall apart without her constant attention. In late September, Adelaide went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth, lasting nearly 20 hours. Jackson stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement even when Adelaide was sure she couldn't go on. But finally, as the sun rose on a beautiful autumn morning, their son was born. He was small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly, as evidenced by his lusty cries. They named him Samuel, after Adelaide's father, and when Jackson held him for the first time, there were tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Jackson whispered, looking down at the tiny bundle in his arms. "You are perfect, both of you." Adelaide, exhausted but happy, smiled at her husband and her son. "We made him together," she said. "All of this we made together." The first few weeks with Samuel were challenging. He was a fussy baby, often awake at night, demanding constant attention. Adelaide and Jackson took turns walking him, feeding him, changing him, both of them stumbling through the new routines of parenthood. But they also fell in love with their son, marveled at his tiny fingers and toes, his first smiles, the way he would grip their fingers with surprising strength. Adelaide would hold him and think about how different her life had become, how much better than she ever could have imagined. Timothy proved invaluable during this time, taking on more responsibility with the ferry and allowing Adelaide to focus on recovering and caring for Samuel. Jackson worked harder than ever, determined to provide for his growing family, taking on extra jobs when he could and putting in long hours on the ferry. As winter approached again, Adelaide stood on the shore of the river one evening, Samuel bundled against her chest in a warm sling. She watched Jackson secure the ferry for the night, his movements efficient and practiced. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Adelaide felt a sense of peace settle over her. A year ago, she had been alone, struggling to survive, wondering if she would make it through the winter. Now she had a husband who loved her, a son who depended on her, a business that was thriving, and a future that looked bright with possibility. Jackson finished with the ferry and walked over to join her, wrapping his arms around both her and Samuel. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How lucky I am," Adelaide said simply. "How different everything is from what I thought it would be." "Better or worse?" Jackson asked with a smile. "So much better," Adelaide replied, leaning into his embrace. "Better than I ever dreamed." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, a family united by love and hard work and the determination to build something lasting. The river flowed past them, constant and unchanging, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. The winter of 1877 was easier than the one before. With Timothy handling much of the daily ferry operation and Jackson managing the business side, Adelaide had time to be a mother, to watch Samuel grow and change with each passing day. She still worked when she could, still helped with crossings when they needed extra hands, but the desperate edge of survival was gone. They had paid off her father's debts by Christmas, a milestone that Adelaide celebrated with quiet tears of relief. She visited her father's grave in the small cemetery outside of town and told him that she had done it, that she had kept the ferry running, that she had made him proud. Samuel's first birthday came and went, marked by a small party with friends from town and a cake that Adelaide had spent all day baking. He was walking now, stumbling around the cabin on unsteady legs, getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of a toddler. Jackson adored him, spending every free moment playing with him, teaching him words, showing him the world. As spring arrived and Samuel grew more independent, Adelaide found herself back at the ferry more regularly. She had missed it, missed the satisfaction of a hard day's work, missed the connection with the passengers who crossed her ferry. With Jackson and Timothy there to help, she could enjoy the work without being crushed by it. One warm April morning, Adelaide was pulling the ferry across the river when she realized something had changed. Her monthly courses were late again, and she had been feeling tired and queasy in the mornings. She was pregnant again, she was almost certain, and the realization filled her with a mixture of joy and trepidation. That evening, after Samuel was in bed, she told Jackson. His reaction was the same as before, pure delight mixed with immediate concern for her well-being. They talked late into the night about how they would manage with 2 children, about whether they needed to hire more help, about expanding the cabin again. "Are you happy?" Jackson asked her as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I am so happy," Adelaide said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Sometimes I have to remind myself that this is real, that I really have all of this." "It is real," Jackson assured her, "and it is only going to get better." Their daughter was born in December, a few weeks before Christmas. The birth was easier than Samuel's had been, and little Grace came into the world with barely a whimper. She was tiny and delicate, with Adelaide's green eyes and Jackson's dark hair, and she fit perfectly in her father's large hands. Samuel, now almost 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside her cradle for hours, just watching her sleep, occasionally reaching out to touch her soft hair. Jackson took a picture of them together at a traveling photographer's studio, a precious image that Adelaide treasured. With 2 children, Adelaide stepped back from the ferry even more, though she still managed the accounts and made decisions about the business. Timothy had become a trusted employee, and they hired another young man to help during the busy seasons. The ferry was profitable now, enough that Jackson could draw a salary and they could save for the future. They expanded the cabin again, adding another bedroom and a larger kitchen. Jackson had become quite skilled at carpentry, and he did most of the work himself, with Adelaide helping when she could and the children playing nearby. The cabin was becoming a real home, filled with laughter and love and the everyday chaos of family life. Years passed in a blur of seasons. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved helping his father on the ferry. Grace was quieter, more thoughtful, but she had her mother's determination and her father's kindness. They were good children, happy and healthy, and Adelaide sometimes had to pinch herself to believe they were really hers. In 1880, Adelaide gave birth to twin boys, Jacob and James. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, but both babies were healthy, if smaller than Samuel and Grace had been. Jackson hired additional help for the ferry so he could stay home more, helping Adelaide manage the chaos of 4 young children. The cabin was bursting at the seams now, and they began talking about building a proper house. Jackson had saved enough money, and with the ferry's steady income, they could afford something bigger, something that could accommodate their growing family. They built the house on a piece of land about a mile from the ferry, a beautiful spot with a view of the river and the mountains beyond. It took a year to complete, but when it was finished, it was everything Adelaide had dreamed of. A big kitchen with a wood stove and plenty of counter space, a sitting room with a fireplace, 4 bedrooms upstairs, and a wraparound porch where they could sit on summer evenings. Moving into the new house felt like the culmination of everything they had worked for. Adelaide stood in the empty kitchen on moving day, looking around at the space that would soon be filled with her family, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Jackson found her there, standing alone, tears streaming down her face. "What is wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing is wrong," Adelaide said, wiping her eyes. "Everything is right. Everything is so perfectly right, and I am just so grateful." Jackson pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I am grateful too," he said, "for you, for our children, for this life we have built together." "I love you, Adelaide." "I love you too," she replied, "more than I can ever say." They moved into the house, filling it with furniture and belongings and the noise of children. Samuel was 8 now, responsible and helpful, often taking charge of his younger siblings. Grace was 6, sweet and gentle, always ready with a hug or a kind word. The twins were 4, identical in appearance but very different in personality. Jacob was adventurous and bold, while James was cautious and thoughtful. Adelaide continued to manage the ferry business, though she rarely did the physical work anymore. She kept the books, negotiated contracts, dealt with suppliers and customers. Jackson and Timothy ran the day-to-day operations, with several other employees helping during the busy seasons. The ferry had become an institution in Fort Bridger, a vital link that connected the town to the surrounding area. Adelaide and Jackson had earned the respect of the community, not just for their hard work but for their integrity and fairness. They treated their employees well, charged fair prices, and were always willing to help someone in need. In 1883, Adelaide's youngest child was born, another daughter they named Hope. She was a surprise, arriving when Adelaide thought she was done having babies, but she was welcomed with joy by the whole family. Samuel, now 11, was old enough to be a real help with the baby, and Grace loved having a little sister to dote on. Adelaide was 41 now, and while she sometimes felt the ache of hard years in her bones, she was healthy and strong. Jackson was 43, with silver threading through his dark hair and laugh lines around his eyes. They had weathered storms and celebrations, hardships and triumphs, and their love had only grown deeper with time. One evening in late summer, after the children were all in bed, Adelaide and Jackson sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains. Hope was asleep in Adelaide's arms, and Jackson had his arm around her shoulders. "You ever think about that first winter?" Jackson asked. "When I started riding the ferry just to watch you work," Adelaide smiled. "I think about it all the time," she said. "I remember being so tired, so worried about making it through. And then you showed up, This cowboy who brought me food and looked at me like I was someone special. You were special, Jackson said. You are special. You took my breath away from the first moment I saw you. I couldn't understand why you kept coming back, Adelaide admitted. I thought surely you would get bored or find someone prettier or easier. There was never anyone else, Jackson said firmly. From the moment I saw you pulling that ferry across the river with such strength and determination, I knew you were the one for me. I would have kept riding that ferry every day forever if that was what it took to win your heart. Adelaide leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. You won my heart a long time ago, she said. You taught me that I didn't have to face everything alone, that accepting help didn't make me weak. You gave me a family and a future and more love than I ever thought possible. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the sounds of the night settling around them. Inside the house, their children slept safely, and tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. But right now, in this moment, everything was perfect. Years continued to pass, each one bringing its own share of changes and growth. Samuel grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over much of the ferry operation from his father. He had Jackson's steady temperament and Adelaide's head for business, and under his management, the ferry thrived. Grace married a schoolteacher from town when she was 20, a kind man named David, who loved her gentle nature. They built a house near Adelaide and Jackson's place, and soon there were grandchildren adding to the family gatherings. The twins followed different paths. Jacob became a rancher, buying land north of Fort Bridger and raising cattle. James went to college back east, becoming a lawyer and eventually returning to Wyoming to practice law. Both married and had children of their own, expanding the family even further. Hope, the youngest, inherited her mother's independent spirit. She worked alongside Samuel on the ferry for years before deciding to open her own business, a general store in town that quickly became popular for its fair prices and excellent service. Adelaide and Jackson watched their children and grandchildren grow with pride and love. They had built something lasting, not just the ferry business but a legacy of hard work, integrity, and family. In the spring of 1900, Adelaide and Jackson celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. The whole family gathered at the house for a party that lasted all day. There was food and music and laughter, stories about the old days and dreams for the future. Samuel stood up to make a toast, his wife and 3 children beside him. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love and hard work can overcome any obstacle. Who showed us what it means to build a life together. Who gave us the best example of marriage that anyone could ask for." Everyone raised their glasses, and Adelaide felt tears streaming down her face as she looked around at all the people she and Jackson had brought into the world, all the love they had created. That night, after everyone had gone home, Adelaide and Jackson walked down to the river. The ferry was still there, still operating, though it had been updated and improved over the years. The original rope and pulley system that Jackson had built all those years ago had been replaced with a more modern mechanism, but the basic operation remained the same. They stood on the shore hand in hand, watching the moonlight reflect off the water. "Do you remember the first time I kissed you?" Jackson asked. "Right here by the river." "I remember everything," Adelaide said. "Every crossing, every conversation, every moment that brought us to here." "Would you do it all again?" Jackson asked. "Knowing how hard it would be, knowing everything we would have to go through?" Adelaide didn't even have to think about it. "In a heartbeat," she said. "Every struggle, every challenge, every moment of doubt, it was all worth it to have this life with you." Jackson pulled her close, And even after 25 years of marriage, Adelaide still felt that flutter in her chest when he held her. "I love you, Adelaide Reynolds," he said. "I loved you when you were a stubborn young woman pulling a ferry across the river by yourself, and I love you now, surrounded by the family we built together." "I love you too, Jackson," Adelaide replied. "Thank you for riding that ferry every day just to watch me work. Thank you for seeing something in me worth loving. Thank you for giving me everything I never knew I wanted." They kissed there by the river, under the moonlight, two people who had started with nothing but determination and love and had built an empire. Not an empire of wealth or power, but an empire of family and community and lasting bonds. As they walked back to the house, Adelaide thought about the girl she had been, alone and frightened, facing an impossible winter with nothing but her own strength to rely on. She thought about how Jackson had changed everything, how his patience and kindness had shown her a different way to live. The house was quiet when they returned, all the grandchildren tucked into various beds throughout the rooms. Adelaide and Jackson climbed the stairs to their bedroom, the same room they had shared for over 2 decades, and prepared for sleep. As Adelaide lay in bed, Jackson's arm around her, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had started with a ferry and a dream of survival, and she had ended with a family, a legacy, and a love that had sustained her through everything. Outside, the river continued to flow, as it had when Adelaide first took over the ferry, as it had when Jackson first rowed across just to watch her work, as it would long after they were both gone. But for now, in this moment, Adelaide was content to close her eyes and rest in the arms of the man who had changed her life forever. The years that followed were gentle ones. Adelaide and Jackson grew older together, their hair turning silver, their steps a little slower, but their love as strong as ever. They watched their children succeed and struggle, their grandchildren grow and learn, their great-grandchildren take their first steps. Samuel continued to run the ferry, eventually passing it on to his own son, keeping it in the family as Adelaide had always hoped. The business remained profitable and respected, a testament to the foundation that Adelaide and Jackson had built all those years ago. When Adelaide was 70, she fell ill with pneumonia. Jackson never left her side, holding her hand, talking to her, reminding her of all the moments they had shared. With excellent care and her own stubborn determination, Adelaide recovered, though she was weaker than before. "You are not allowed to leave me yet," Jackson told her when she was finally well enough to sit up. "We still have too many sunsets to watch together." Adelaide smiled at him, this man who had been her partner and her love for over 40 years. "I am not going anywhere," she promised. "Not without you." They had 7 more years together, 7 years of quiet afternoons and family dinners, of watching the river flow and the seasons change. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, a crowd so large that they had to hold the party outside. Jackson passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold January night in 1912, just shy of his 80th birthday. Adelaide woke to find him still and quiet beside her, and for a moment she couldn't breathe from the pain of it. But then she felt the warmth of the life they had built together, the family that surrounded her, and she knew that while Jackson was gone, his love remained. She lived for 2 more years, long enough to see another great-grandchild born, long enough to know that the ferry and the family would continue. She spent her days telling stories to anyone who would listen. Stories about a young woman who ran a ferry all alone and a cowboy who rode it every day just to watch her work. On a spring morning in 1914, Adelaide passed away quietly, sitting in her favorite chair on the porch, looking out at the river that had been such a constant presence in her life. She was 83 years old, and she died knowing that she had lived a full, rich, meaningful life. At her funeral, the whole town of Fort Bridger turned out to pay their respects. Samuel spoke about his mother's strength and determination, about how she had built a business and a family from nothing but will and hard work. Grace talked about her kindness and her love, about how she had made each of her children feel special and valued. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren shared memories and stories, painting a picture of a woman who had touched countless lives. They buried Adelaide next to Jackson in the cemetery outside of town, beneath a large oak tree with a view of the mountains. On the headstone, beneath their names and dates, were simple words that captured the essence of their story. Together they built a legacy of love. The ferry continued to operate for another 20 years before a bridge was finally built across the river, making the crossing obsolete. But the house that Adelaide and Jackson had built remained, passed down through generations, a testament to what two people could create when they worked together. And on quiet evenings, when the light hit the river just right, people said you could still see them there. Adelaide and Jackson, standing by the water, hands clasped, looking at each other with the same love that had sustained them through nearly 50 years of marriage. Their story became legend in Fort Bridger, told and retold to new generations. The ferry operator who wouldn't quit and the cowboy who fell in love with her strength. The woman who faced impossible odds and the man who chose to stand beside her. The couple who built an empire of love that lasted long after they were gone. It was a simple story in many ways, a tale of hard work and determination, of patience and kindness, of two people who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. But it was also a powerful story, a reminder that love can thrive even in the harshest conditions, that partnership can overcome any obstacle, that the choices we make and the people we choose to love can echo through generations. In the end, Adelaide and Jackson's legacy wasn't just the ferry or the business, or even the large family they had created. Their legacy was the example they set, the proof that one person's strength combined with another person's devotion could create something lasting and meaningful. The river still flows past Fort Bridger, carving its eternal path through the Wyoming landscape. The ferry is long gone, replaced by modern bridges and roads. But the story remains, passed down through Adelaide and Jackson's descendants, shared with anyone who will listen. It is a story about a woman who refused to give up, about a cowboy who saw her worth, about a love that transformed two lives and created a legacy that would last forever. It is a story about the power of partnership, the importance of perseverance, and the enduring nature of true love. And it all started on a cold winter morning in 1876, when a tired young woman pulled a ferry across the North Platte River, and a cowboy rode it just to watch her work, not knowing that they were beginning a story that would be told for generations to come. A story of love and strength, and the beautiful life that two people can build when they choose to face the world together.